I'm really pleased to be here and in the Czech Republic. I always consider the Czech Republic to be like one of my soul countries. The very first demonstration I went on as a young man was in August 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in those days. And I remember I was at McGill University and we organized a demonstration of people, mainly as it happened, East European immigrants who were already there. And I think that event gave me an incredible degree of belief in people. I mean, that was the incredible thing about '68, is seeing a society where people are scared to express themselves. You know, a society where you kind of feel that it's going to remain totalitarian forever, suddenly have that kind of spiritual, you know, sort of capacity to make themselves felt and to be one. I mean, that solidarity, I think, is really, really incredible. I also learned a lot about Czech literature. You know, my favorite author of all time is Kafka. But my wife and I often go back and look at that interesting novel, The Joke, which is so relevant to every society, because The Joke, although it's written about what's happened in the Czech Republic, reminds me of many, many other places, including Britain, where I live, although The Joke takes on a different connotation. So for me, this is quite important that I'm here. I also think that democracy is a really important issue. And sometimes we forget what democracy is. Because if you recall the origins of the word democracy, it's got two sides to it. It's got demos, which is the people, and it's got the other side, which relates to kratia, which relates to power. So it's really about people having power. And I think it's important to bear that in mind all the time, because whenever we talk about democracy, we often tend to think about it as a set of procedures, or as Winston Churchill put it, as a way of electing people in the most efficient kind of a way. We tend to think about democracy as almost like an institution. And we don't really remember that one very important fact of life is that without the demos, democracy becomes this kind of abstract sort of monster into which you can put in everything. You have to remember that nobody in the world today argues against democracy. I mean, even the North Korean government claims to be the Democratic Republic of North Korea, or whatever they call themselves. The trouble is that democracy is used in that kind of promiscuous way. And because it's done in that kind of way, we forget to ask the question, take a step back. What is it? And why is it that in human history, despite its discovery 2,500 years ago, it's relatively been a fairly estranged flower that is very seldom given the chance to flourish? It's really worth thinking about it, and I think looking at history allows us to do that. I began to get interested in democracy specifically as a result of a debate I was involved in about 5 years ago in Amsterdam. It was a debate held at the Bali. I don't know if you've ever been to the Bali in Amsterdam. That's like a liberal, kind of trendy debating place. And I was there to argue my case, because I'm a democracy absolutist, against other people who took a slightly more instrumental approach towards it. And when I finished speaking, this guy put up his hand and he says, "Professor Furedi, do you actually believe that democracy is something that's good in and of itself? Do you actually think that democracy is a value?" And I said, "Absolutely. You know, democracy is a good in and of itself." And the point that he was really getting at, which is very, very common, is that he probably thinks that democracy is good if his party or if his candidate gets elected. Then democracy works. If, on the other hand, somebody else gets elected, then democracy becomes imperfect. Democracy doesn't really work under those circumstances. And I think one of the problems that we have today, and it relates to Jakob's speech as well, is that people pay lip service to freedom, but what they all often say, certainly in the Anglo-American world, is I believe in freedom, but. And it's what comes after the but that's really important, the qualifications. And similarly, we have, I believe in democracy, but. And there's all those other qualifications that they kind of bring in. Now, almost everything we discussed so far today has actually been anticipated in discussions in ancient Greece and Rome in the Renaissance. Many of these issues were already there. And I think it's well worth going back a little bit. One of the most important points that I argue in my book, Democracy Unlocked, is that actually before you had a theory of democracy, you had democracy already in existence. Democracy wasn't didn't come out of an intellectual discussion or a book. The people of Athens acted democratically and ensured that their voice was heard and their voice could not really be ignored. But what's very interesting is that the word democracy is actually invented by people who hated democracy. So the very term democracy wasn't invented by Democrats, but by the opponents of democracy. And what's also interesting is that before you had anybody write anything positive about democracy, in other words, before you had the development of democratic theory, you already had anti-democratic theory, being written. In fact, arguments against democracy, hatred towards democracy, is the origins of Western political theory and Western political philosophy. You find that very clearly in Plato. You find that very strongly being expressed most eloquently by Socrates when he says, he's having a dialogue with some friends, and Socrates says, isn't it really weird? Isn't it really weird that when we want to build a ship, we get a shipwright to kind of build the ship. We get an expert who's very good at building ships. And when we want to sail that ship, we don't let any Tom, Dick, and Harry sail that ship. We get a professional navigator to do that. And isn't it strange that when we build a house, a fine building in Athens, we don't let just anybody build that house. We get an architect. You get an architect and an expert to build that house. So why is it, he says, when we rely on all these experts to do all these things in our social and economic life, why is it that when it comes to politics, we don't rely on political experts? Why do we rely on ordinary people, the demos, to make decisions? Because that's the way that decision-making was carried out. And he basically is saying that democracy is inherently flawed because rather than relying on people like himself and other expert philosophers, it relies upon the energy and the insight of people who don't understand this. And Socrates wasn't just simply opposed to participation and the voice of the people. He really feared what would happen if ordinary people learned to read. I don't know if you know this, but when writing was invented in Greece, and although there are earlier forms of writing, Socrates wrote a lengthy series of essays, as we would call them now, where he makes the point that the problem with reading, of publishing material, is that it's okay for me and people like me who understand, who are sophisticated, we understand what this is really all about, but what happens if those books or those things get into the wrong hands? In other words, what happens if ordinary people read it? Because they'll misunderstand it. They'll misunderstand what's being written there, and therefore he saw reading as a kind of pharmacon, as he called it. A pharmacon being both a drug, but also poisonous, also toxic. And that's something that we need to bear in mind. The first discussions about fake news, the first discussions about how can we trust the people, emerge in Greece, ancient Greece. The literature on the demagogue, the guy who's a good speaker and is misleading the people, is raised there at that particular time, as is the fact that an argument gets developed in ancient Greece in the critique of the sophists, where basically what they're saying is that the issues that confront Athenian society are too complex, are really too complex for people to deal with, and therefore they should not be in a position to participate in the decision-making process. So what I'm really trying to say is that in the very area, the very place where democracy is invented, anti-democracy and hatred for democracy becomes palpably strong, to the point at which, by the time we move on from Socrates, Plato to the successive generations, democracy becomes synonymous with what's called mob rule, the rule of the mob. That's essentially how it's seen. Now, if you look at the history of what happens in the centuries that follow from there, you will find that almost every century, democracy has got a negative connotation. When you look at the philosophical contributions, the books that people write, when they talk about democracy, they talk about it as a problem, as something that should be avoided. I've not come across a single account of democracy until about the 18th century, where democracy is associated with positive connotations. It disappears. It totally disappears. You know, what the demos did in Athens becomes a warning that you have to be beware of, because unless you watch it, unless you give power, if you give power to the people, some bad things will happen. And it's really in the 18th century, first with the French Revolution and to a lesser extent the American Revolution, that some traces of a true democratic orientation begin to kick in. And I think that's just really important to bear in mind, because then what happens is that from the 18th century onwards, democracy becomes gradually accepted. But democracy becomes gradually accepted as an ideal only because it's now recognized that you need to have a degree of popular sovereignty, a degree of popular participation in the new mass societies that are created, if you're going to have a genuine democratic orientation, a genuine political system that can work. And therefore, you have a literature developing in the 19th and 20th century that says we have no choice. We need democracy, but it's not because we love democracy, but because we need some way of gaining consensus and gaining consent. So democracy then becomes entirely instrumentally used, not as a good in and of itself, but as a medium for gaining consent within society. In other words, governments need to show that they've been voted by the people, that the people consented to them in order to do what they feel like. So there really isn't any genuine democratic aspiration, and that's something that's recognized by genuine Democrats, when they realize that at the end of the day, that culture of democracy is conspicuously feeble. Now, I think that a number of arguments have evolved sort of in this, and I can understand why people react like that. I always think of the Dutch philosopher, the Dutch Jewish philosopher, Spinoza, who really embodies this ambivalence about democracy. Because when he was writing in the 16th century, he was very much ahead of his time. He actually liked the idea of people participating. He liked the idea of democracy. And living in the Dutch Republic, or the establishment of the Dutch Republic, he was also aware of the fact that the Calvinist church in Holland had a disproportionate amount of influence on the people that were living in Amsterdam. And therefore, the church could sway the voting behavior, the political behavior of the people. And what he was really worried about was that the Republic has just been established. His best friend, John de Witt, was the head of the Amsterdam Republic. And what he was really worried about was that the church could mobilize the people against the Republic, which they did. They murdered his friend John de Witt. And his reaction to that event was traumatic. He basically argued that democracy is no good, that there's no point in creating a situation where the people are allowed to participate and have such kind of power. And he even went so far as to say that the books that I write, the books that I, Baruch Spinoza, write, is not for the people. I don't want them to read this, because presumably if they read it, they would misunderstand it. And that's the kind of dilemma that often occurs when we become disappointed with the people. I think that disappointment with the people earlier on was expressed by Jacob as elite panic. And that's a common theme throughout the decades. I would call that demophobia, where essentially you fear the people. You actually fear that they're unpredictable and they're going to do the wrong things and vote the wrong kind of a way. And that kind of fear of the people is something that has kind of continued. One of the ways in which that fear of the people and of democracy is often expressed is by the use of psychology. For example, you have, from the 19th century onwards, mob psychology, mass psychology being used to basically argue that the people are easily suggestible, that the people are not rational. They cannot be expected not to come under the sway of advertisers or the media or whatever. And the argument was that because the people are inherently irrational and inherently suggestible, therefore we have to find a way of limiting democracy and preventing people from being able to exercise sort of their own, express their own opinion in the old way. And in fact, in the 19th, 20th century, mass psychology became extremely popular and effective. And it was used in the interwar period as a way of arguing for a limited form of democracy, that democracy needs to be curbed and limited. And I think that one of the things that I've discovered in the course of my research is that this kind of defensive idea towards democracy actually leads to a conception of democracy which is one that wants democracy but without the demos. Right? I think that that's the world that we live in now, where most political leaders that you talk to swear on the Bible of democracy, but they would rather that the people's influence was somehow limited. So how do we limit the influence of people? Well, the most important way that we do it in the West is through the outsourcing of political decision-making. That means that more and more political decisions are taken out of the public political realm and handed over to expert bodies. We have in England, the Bank of England, more or less running our finance policy. I mean, they make decisions about all kinds of important economic issues. They've never been elected. Nobody elected the bankers of England. But nevertheless, their power is arguably as great as our members of parliament or even many of our cabinet ministers. We often outsource decision-making, political decision-making, to the courts. We have this process that Jürgen Habermas called the juridification of public life, where more and more the courts become responsible for public policy, and their interpretation of public policy becomes more important than the decisions that are made by parliaments. And finally, what we have is the growing tendency to rely on international bodies to make the decisions instead of the government. And that's done quite effectively. I think one of the reasons why Brexit happened in England was because the successive British governments, both Labour and the Conservatives, got into the habit that whenever they wanted to pass a law that was unpopular with the electorate, they would get the European Union or the European Court of Law, whatever it's called, to make that decision. And then they come back and they say, look, we have no choice. We have no choice but to do what we've been instructed by the European Union or instructed by the courts. So you have this gradual outsourcing of decision-making. And allied to that, you got another process which limits the workings of democracy, which is what I suppose you could call insulated democracy, where you insulate the political decision makers, politicians, from the pressure that's being exercised by the public. And you try to create a whole host of intermediate organizations as a way of avoiding having to take all these things into account. So these are, to me, some of the important and interesting developments. And I suppose where I would slightly, one of the things that I'm a little bit concerned about is that as you devalue the people, the demos, so you begin to sacralize expertise. And increasingly, expertise and the role of the expert becomes really quite important in ways that is inappropriate, because I think experts have an important role to play, but we need to keep a distinction between experts and the representatives of the public who are there to make political decisions. And as a result of that, what you have are some very grotesque ways of regarding democracy, because democracy then becomes seen as a second-order principle. A good example of that, something that even shocked me, and I don't get shocked very, very easily, was when you had the pandemic. And in the course of the pandemic, a lot of people in Europe, certainly in Britain, were arguing, okay, China is authoritarian. We know that China is authoritarian, but look at them. They got the pandemic under control. Isn't that really good that somehow they traded democracy for public health, or they traded democracy for security? And that kind of anti-democratic sensibility really came to the fore in the course of the pandemic. And of course, what it then led to was a reaction where you had conspiracy theories and various kind of extremist reactions to that, which were equally unhelpful. But the problem was that we just ended up in a situation in the course of the pandemic where on the one hand, we politicized public health, and then we medicalized politics, all going on at the same time as a result of this. Instead of taking the people, the public, into our confidence, instead of having a grown-up discussion with our public. And this leads to me to my three main points, the three main lessons that I've learned. And I'm struggling with this. I have to tell you, that I too sometimes get very angry when the wrong people, at least in my eyes, get elected. I get very disappointed when I see political parties being very popular that I find distasteful. So I can understand why that guy in Amsterdam was very critical of me. But unless we come to the conclusion that we believe in democracy, even if the wrong people get elected, because we believe that living democratically is better than having somebody we like in government at the expense of democracy. Unless we have that approach, then the whole spirit of democracy will wither away. So for me, there are three issues that are really quite important. Number one, it goes back to culture again. A couple of people have mentioned culture as being really quite important. I think that where culture really comes in relation to democracy is that democracy has to mean something. In other words, democracy has to be meaningful in the way that we conduct our lives. If it's external to us to the point at which we see it as something that we do every 2 or 4 years, and if we think that our role in a democratic society is to show up and sort of vote at election time, then democracy itself will become entirely a procedure. And as you know, laws and procedures, as important they are, they lack the moral depth to touch us. They lack the moral depth to touch us, which is why, sort of legitimation by process and law never works. And Max Weber made the very famous point that laws, as important as they are, can never motivate people. They can never somehow inspire. People don't get up in the morning, brush their teeth and say, I love the law, right? They don't say, oh, I love transparency and I love procedure. Don't say that, because that is external to their very being as individuals. So democracy has got to have meaning. And that means that we need to have a much more sophisticated account of a normative foundation for democracy. I think one of the problems that has been a recurring theme with democracy from the beginning of its first appearance is that it lacked a clear normative foundation. It's not good enough to say that it's the people that should decide, which is fine, and it's not good enough to say that this is the fairest way of gaining consent and the best way of getting people elected and running society. It's got to have some kind of normative aspect. In other words, what I'm really arguing, this is where normativity comes into it, is that we have to learn to live democratically and to educate everybody, or as much as people as possible, to live democratically as something that's inherent in their life. And this leads me to the second point. What is the guarantee? What guarantees do we have that a democratic system can continue to survive and continue to exist? Now, where do we put our trust? How do we make sure that coups and dictators and tyrants do not emerge and do not usurp the kind of democracy that we live in? Because we have many, many examples in history where that has occurred. And a lot of people think that the way you ensure that democracy is enforced and democracy survives and democracy lives on is by relying on constitutions or relying on laws. And I think that obviously laws and constitutions are really quite important. The rule of law is really quite critical in this respect. But at the end of the day, laws and constitutions by themselves are not able to guarantee that if something happens, it doesn't go pear-shaped, that the democratic system that we live in doesn't get unraveled. So what do we do? And I think at the end of the day, we have to rely, the only guarantee that we have of preserving and defending democracy are citizens. And have you heard the word citizen recently? Because I tell you, where I come from, we don't talk about citizens anymore. I mean, the word citizen in different languages means something else, citoyen or whatever language you speak in. But the citizen is somebody who we assume isn't just a guy that votes now and again. A citizen is somebody who's got a duty and a sense of responsibility for the society that they live in. And citizenship used to really mean something. Today, when we talk about citizenship and citizen, we use it promiscuously as a kind of, oh yeah, citizen, you're a citizen. It doesn't really mean very much. And a lot of people are aware of that, and for that reason, we have what's called citizenship education in schools. But citizenship education is not something that you can teach in a classroom. Citizens are people that are educated, yes, but not educated simply within the schooling system. They're educated in their community. They're the product of their community life. And they are the embodiments of certain values and ways of being that are prevalent within their society. And I think that one of the areas where we really are very bad at is to assume that citizenship can run on its own and it will work without us taking that aspect seriously. I think the kind of things that you guys are doing here in the Czech Republic is really quite important. But you also have to address the question of what can you do, how can you contribute to making Czech people into real citizens, into genuine citizens? Because in the end, the voting scheme that you were discussing earlier on does rely on people acting as citizens rather than simply showing up and in an unthinking kind of a way, as you were saying earlier on, just voting for the least evil. So citizenship seems to me to be really quite important. And to me, if you can bind together a normative foundation for democracy and spell that out, along with taking citizenship and really sort of celebrating citizenship as being really something that's quite important. Unless we can do that, then democracy itself will become emptied of its meaning. I do fear that certainly in many parts of the world, including the West, democracy is fast becoming a zombie category. I know it's very difficult to kill zombies, right? So democracy will carry on in that kind of zombified kind of a way. But if democracy has that kind of zombie character to it, then it will do very little to inspire a genuine democratic spirit. So to end on, because I know I'm the last speaker and you're all twitching and thinking about other things quite understandably, we call this the graveyard shift, where I come from. I would just suggest that we all need to go back to basics and learn from our historical experience and understand that democracy is really about the demos. And because it's really all about the demos, we have a duty and a responsibility to find ways and means of engaging with them and to become not just engaging with them, but to make sure that we, you, me, everybody else, becomes part of that demos. We don't want to be seen as coming in from the outside. We are part of the demos, and we see our role in those circumstances as one that educates the people while we're educating ourselves. Thank you.
All right, Professor Furedi, thank you for really quite an inspiring talk. And unless you want to run off for the interview, I would like to open the forum for at least a couple of questions, because I have a few at least, and I think more people would as well. So, yeah, Jonah.
It's working? So I'll lead to a question, but I first want to speak on behalf of Socrates, which I expected me to do. Socrates doesn't claim to be an expert. He claims, in fact, to know that he does not know. He refuses to take payment. He refuses to be called a teacher. He does not claim to be an expert. He poses the question about techne, shopkeepers, because he wants to ask what's the kind of knowledge that's needed to run the state. And what those dialogues, and many scholars, Ruchnik's book, Hyland's book, Gonzalez point out, those dialogues in which the techne is brought up, all the attempts to come up with a technical definition of the knowledge needed to run a government are destroyed. The point being to show that we need a kind of knowing to run the state, but it is not technical knowledge. And the thing about writing, it's not reading, it's writing, is that Socrates was worried it would remove people from active dialogue. He was worried that people who did the writing couldn't defend themselves. The words there couldn't tell us what was going on behind them. And so the removal from active dialogue was the concern. He wasn't sort of dedicated to eradicating literacy or something like that. And so I think presenting him as, I think it's fair to present him as an anti-democrat. He was in opposition, but he's also anti-oligarchy. He resisted all forms of government. And this is another way in which he was apolitical. He refused to enter into political life. He was constantly told by his demonium not to. I think it's fair to represent him as a critic of the idea that democracy would solve the problems that Athens was facing. And his opposition to democracy, I think, is pretty well placed in one sense, because of course it's a democracy that kills him, and it kills him by a majority vote through a democratic process. And so I think it's important to note that he was foreseeing a potential threat, which came to pass. So I'm wondering if, I mean, you ended on, I think, a really interesting and powerful point about zombie citizens, but I'm wondering the degree to which the causal arrow goes the other way. I wrote a book about zombies, and the fact that most people increasingly identify with zombies, this is why the zombie genre is so powerful right now, and that it's the zombification that is undermining citizenship. People feel increasingly as if their lives are meaningless. A survey in the UK in 2019, people from 16 to 29 years old, 85% found their lives completely meaningless. And I put it to you that issues about trying to get at meaning were actually the core of the Socratic project, and therefore, although we can reject Socrates' rejection of democracy, isn't it relevant to bring back his deep concern for meaning and epistemic humility as we try to come to an understanding of what that meaning might be?
Well, you know, I'm actually a big fan of Socrates, and I've written a chapter in a book on the subject where I try to deal with the important contribution that Plato makes to the math of Socrates, and in terms of his kind of capacity to give reflection sort of such an incredible importance. And I think that the role that he plays within Greek society is really quite important, because in a sense, it is through his mouth that we have the emergence of the whole Western philosophical tradition. So to that extent, Socrates to me is really quite important. And even today, his death, whether it was in the way it was described or not, is still very shocking when you actually think about it. And you have to remember that here is Socrates, and he says, and he could flee. He doesn't have to die. People say, leave Athens, but he says no. And when you have such a principled approach towards public life and reflection, you can only feel that's positive. And also, as it happens, I totally agree with your meaning. I mean, I really feel that the quest for meaning in our world is inextricably linked to the constitution of our public life. And one of the problems that we have at the moment is that we encourage, instead of addressing that problem in a grown-up way, we encourage people to find meaning in the most trite, trivial dimensions of our everyday experience. And therefore, you have everything. I don't want to sound like a complete old-fashioned idiot, but a lot of my students find meaning in cutting themselves, or finding tattoos, or sort of doing very dramatic surgery to their bodies. And that's the meaning that they kind of get. And you can really understand that kind of negative way of dealing with it is in a sense the consequence of our failure to address that problem. And I also, something you were hinting at earlier on, is that unfortunately in our world, people associate meaning with religion. And they often tell me, well, Frank, because they know I'm an atheist. How can you as an atheist, deal with meaning? As if somehow the church has got a monopoly on it, and that, we are just idiots who are, that it's unthinkable for there to be a humanist kind of secular way of approaching this thing. But where they are right is that people like us are not doing the business of engaging with that problem, possibly because it's too big and maybe a little bit abstract, but possibly, I think it's bad faith on our part that it's much easier to deal with the more technical, immediate questions than to address this really huge issue of our time.
I very much agree with your point of citizenship. It's so important for democracy to work that people are responsible. They feel their citizenship, and I think it is important to give people the opportunity to do so. And you mentioned it that it's lesser evil is not working, and this is, I wanted to stress that if people have more votes, it actually promotes the citizenship, and also it gives the advantage to people who are responsible, who do their homework, to have a better influence on the result. So this is, I would like to stress that the more votes mean that people are motivated towards citizenships, and also those people who are responsible, they have a greater advantage. They have more influence on the democratic process with absolutely uniform equal voter rights. Voting rights.
I agree with you.
I wanted to actually touch upon a similar thing, because the sort of changing the system or the rules of the game that you're in, I think may really does shuffle the deck of the cards that we're playing, and perhaps leads to a more exciting democratic game that we have. And but I wanted to sort of go back to the more, say, soft question about active citizenship, or at least trying to resist, at least as you said, the sort of zombie-like existence of many of us who are striving to be citizens, and we want to hear that, or we want to feel that, that heart throbbing of democracy. We want to sort of be in touch with the telos of democracy. But what my colleagues and I were discussing this many times, is that for some reason, at least in the context that I can at least see, is that you can mobilize people quite effectively, and you can get them to stand for democracy once there is a clear threat. But when things are going quite well, all of a sudden it's very hard to find a positive vision of democracy. And that's where sort of, it's almost as if the comfort and things going well leads to this zombified state that you're in. And perhaps this, what I'm talking is just a preface for a longer conversation between you and John, because I think a big part of what John is trying to do is trying to get this unlocking of the meaning-making machinery that is not dependent on, say, drastic measures like, all of a sudden being in a war or facing a clear enemy, which I think are sort of fairly easy ways to get meaning in life, although they're quite drastic. But what are your thoughts as to, how to get to that citizenship? Because when you say, let's try to be more active and more real about what citizenship means in democracy, I would love to do that, but I don't know what to imagine. I don't know what I would do tomorrow when I wake up and say, all right, let's be a less zombified citizen.
Well, I haven't got the answer, but I've got two thoughts. The first thought is that it's when people have a clear choice. I mean, a clear choice, not simply as left and right or conservative, liberal, anything like that. A clear choice with a different vision of the future and of the world. That clarifies things for people. You guys probably all hate Brexit, but one thing that happened in Brexit is that people that have never read anything, never talked about politics in their lives, suddenly everyone's arguing about what's the nation, what's national sovereignty, and I was just quite surprised. I must confess, one of my bad habits, I go football every second week to support my team, and they call me the math professor there because I'm the only professor. Everybody else, plumbers, electricians, whatever. I go to the football match, and they're not talking about the game in the way they always do, but they're talking about, sort of how they should vote and, and what are the issues and everything else. And I thought that was an interesting experience seeing that happening, because it tells you that if you have a clear alternative, a clear choice about a certain vision of the world, it helps people become creative and imaginative in a way that isn't the case usually. So that's the first thing that I've learned. So somehow we have got to give a choice where we are presenting people with something that, it's got a bit of vision to it. It's got a little bit of vision to it. The second thing is relates directly to your point, but I haven't got an answer for that. I spent a little bit of time in the Ukraine during the war. And for me, it was like, here are people who have almost spontaneously internalized the Greek virtues in the way that they were conducting themselves. Obviously, they haven't really read Aristotle or anything else like that, but you saw the courage, right? You saw the sense of duty. You saw even, sort of the virtue of phronesis. I don't know how you, phronesis, it's like practical wisdom. I think that's probably the closest way of talking about it. And all those, and I was overwhelmed, because here are these people, and they are all of a sudden being citizens. But of course, as the trouble was, as you were suggesting, is that it needed a war, it needed being invaded for people to realize that and to kind of come into their own. So what that tells us, what that tells me, is that whatever we think, those sentiments, those potentials exist within human beings. It's there within people. It's not something that's going to be artificially brought in. We have just got to learn to turn what is potential into actual, and activate that, find some way of crystallizing those capacities that are there. And that requires philosophers, psychologists, it requires everybody here with different disciplines to find ways and means of addressing that problem. Now, that might seem very dreamlike, but I think it's very real. If they can do it in Ukraine, why not in Prague or why not in England? I mean, we're just as human as they are. We have the same capacities.
And we have time for one more question, if there is one.
Thank you for this opportunity. Just one question, Frank, on the threats to democracy that you mentioned, that the power is being outsourced to, I don't know, Bank of England or some other institutions, or weakening of democracies rather. What do you think about technology? Because especially the young generation of people, they're using technologies that are completely out of the government system, and they have nothing to do with democratic voting, and increasingly they have influence on the real world. So is that not one of your major concerns as well? That basically, sort of going back to the questions of the platforms and then all these technologies basically undermining democracy.
I did a research project for the French phone company called Orange, because they asked me to look at children's behavior online and sort of how they were behaving and what the problems were. And it became very clear to me that all the problems that the children were having, their digital bedrooms and everything else, were essentially problems that have their source offline, and that we often tend to recycle offline problems online because it seemed much clearer to us. And I've come to the conclusion, I've become a real technophile, and I've got no problem with technology. I think very often we blame social media and various other things for problems of our own making within society itself. So what the social media does is that it doesn't create polarization. The polarization pre-exists the social media. If you look back at sort of the last 20, 30 years, even before social media, many of the incipient sort of tensions that have come to the fore were already there. So I think on balance, we should regard the social media as as potential, not a solution, but as an instrument that we can use to solve our problems if we get our act together. And I think we should be wary of blaming the media or the technology for problems that have their source in the non-technological domain. And I say this despite the fact that as my family will tell you, I'm a complete klutz when it comes to technology.
Well, and if I can ask just a very quick follow-up, I mean, I think it's pretty much proven that the social media companies can influence elections by simply showing or not showing certain posts to to people. That's one issue that I think is real. The other issue, though, is that as people tend to, and I'm not, I'm all for technologies, but I'm just stating what's happening. As people tend to use these networks more, use the platforms more, the kind of decision making is moving out of the formal governments or politics towards these platforms. That's where the decisions are made. Maybe they have some voting systems, but it's not the formal type of governance. It's being replaced by something else. Now, the issue is that, you know, who writes the rules for that digital world, and how this is governed, and whether we can talk about democracy there. Maybe something better will come out of it. I'm just saying that this is what we see happening, these two phenomena.
Well, I see what you see, but I would say that the problem for us is the contraction of the public sphere. So when public life itself becomes contracted and it doesn't motivate people to participate and get stuck in, that's when you have people, you know, hiding in their digital bedrooms. That's when you have people, you know, sort of reinventing their lives, you know, somewhere else, because there is no attraction there. You know, the public sphere hasn't got that dynamism. You know, sort of, a lot of my friends in London are trying to reinvent the public sphere by having these cafes and other places. They're hoping, I don't think it's going to work, because that cafes were okay in the 18th century. It's not going to work now, but you do have to find a way of making the public sphere relevant and attractive, because otherwise, that's why this happens. And so you and I should be addressing that problem, rather, and obviously those bad things you describe are happening, but if you tackle the logically prior problem, which is the public sphere, I think that things will fall in place at that point.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.